The reason why John Stuart Mill had a hit book at all, the reason why utilitarianism became a commonly used concept in debates here on the internet in the 21st century at all, is that it appeals to a side of our brain that we seem to exercise every day in the marketplace in most modern Western societies. Most of us all the time are exercising the part of our brain that chooses, should I do this or should I do that, in terms of whatever I will enjoy more. Should I buy this product? Should I buy that product? And it's very difficult when you live in that kind of culture, when you live in that kind of epoch or era, to take a stand against utilitarianism and point out the ways in which, no, this is fundamentally, ineluctably evil, not useful, and really wrong. In this video, we're actually taking an even more disturbing step in explaining to you that the kind of reasoning utilitarianism is based on, the so-called pleasure-pain calculus, is flawed in yet another important way. It's flawed because very often you're comparing something real to something unreal, or we could say something abstract to something even more abstract, something unreal to something else that's dramatically less real.
Previously on XMen.
But there is no question to be asked. There is no salience. There is no relevance of taking this abstract equation whereby you have an imaginary amount of pleasure and enjoyment, and then you subtract the amount of suffering and pain, and then ask, well, how much is left over? Is it a positive or negative number at the end of the equation?
So it's not clear to me why he's talking about an imaginary amount of pleasure and pain. What would be going on in that calculation is we figure out how much good it would take, like it would be caused to torture to commit the act of torture. So I don't know where the imaginary thing is coming from, but let's keep going.
2,000 years later.
You should be able to take this stuff apart and put it back together again like it's nothing, homeboy. Okay. Let's say you meet a farmer on a field and you say, wow, that's a big truck. You have a lot of apples loaded in the back of that truck. I wonder how many apples are in the back of that truck. And he tells you, there are 12,283 apples loaded into the back of this truck. Okay. Is that a real number? 12,283? How do you know that precise number for the number of apples? He says, well, we weigh them. We don't even weigh the apples. We weigh the truck. We weigh it before it's loaded with apples, then we weigh it after, and then we subtract the difference. And then we take the weight and we divide it by the average weight of an apple. Okay, so we know how much on average an apple weighs. We know how much the total weight is the apples. And then I'm giving you this precise number of exactly how many apples are in the truck. So is that a real number? Okay. All numbers are abstractions. There's a sense in which you can insist, hey, numbers are just created by human culture. They reflect language and civilization and our subjective psychological. Yeah. But look, there's a difference between counting the number of apples through extrapolation based on an average, right? There's a difference between that and actually counting the apples. You could count the apples by paying a human being to sit there with a chalkboard and tally how many apples are being loaded in the back of the truck. There are also more technologically sophisticated ways. There are actually very sophisticated machines used by oyster farmers, because oysters are worth a lot of money, where they drop the oysters down a chute and they calculate not just the number, but the precise size, weight, volume, the shape of the shell. They fall down a chute and they're scanned with lasers as they go. So you could take one of those oyster counting machines and you could put the apples through them. You can know precisely how many apples, precisely their size, shape, volume, weight, etc., etc. Okay, if you wanted to. And then you'd say, okay, so that's a real number. There's a sense in which that number is more real than the other number that's based on extrapolation and based on belief in an average, right? Now, if you have a farm where the particular species of tree in the particular climate, all of the apples very closely conform to that average, the number may have real predictive power. If you have a farm where there's a huge variation in apples, some of them are huge, some of them are tiny. Okay, this stuff is not complex. For a philosophy professor, when I say a number is unreal, a unit of measure is unreal, we're dealing with different types of units of measure, right? Different types of reality. You should be able to take this stuff apart and put it back together again. And homie, you know I'm doing this with no script and no preparation. And no, I didn't even bother to read John Stuart Mill for this video. All right, if I say to you, you know, there's a certain amount of harm done by cutting off an organ of your body. Let's keep it real here, people. Let's talk about male circumcision. There's a certain amount of harm done by cutting off this part of the body, and then the boy has to live the rest of his life with about 60% of the nerve endings removed from the end of his penis. Okay, so that's harm. That's real. Okay? And we could try to assign a number to it. We could try to measure it, but we're talking about something real. Then the mother of this newborn baby tells you, well, you know, it may be that circumcision does harm. It may be that circumcision impairs his ability to feel sensations through his penis. It may have psychological effects. It may cause him just physical pain and suffering. Yeah. But you know what? She gets a certain kind of pleasure. She gets a certain kind of satisfaction out of the idea that she's carrying on a tradition that her parents and her grandparents participated in. Now, you are going to tell me that in the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, you are going to tell me that it's possible to carry out a calculus, to write an equation on a blackboard that compares the harm being done to the pleasure or gratification or enjoyment, that we can assign units, we can assign numerals that are equally real to these two things. The only way they can be equally real is if they're both equally absurd. Because this is part of the tragedy of the human condition. Happiness is not real. Pleasure is not real. Enjoyment is not real. And when we talk about harm, when we talk about the harm done by cutting off a human limb, when we talk about the harm done by torturing a person to death, we are talking about something real. If there were any validity to the utilitarian approach of creating an equation, a calculus, assigning a unit value to the harm done and a unit value to the benefit, why is this not the way we evaluate, for example, whether or not to torture animals to death for the sake of scientific progress? Vivisection, in a word. Right? Why can't, this is a highly funded industry with highly educated, intellectual people, scientists doing it. Why can't they ever come up with an equation? Why is it that the European Union, with its teams of highly paid lawyers, couldn't take this philosophy from John Stuart Mill and Bentham and put it into practice and just assign a number, assign a unit value to how much suffering is involved with having an ape kept in captivity and having experiments done on it, and then how much benefit is going to be achieved, how much pleasure people are going to have because now they know more about, AIDS or cancer or any other significant thing. They don't even pretend to draw up these equations because they know that they're meaningless. They know that they can justify any evil whatsoever. Okay? The most gruesome experiment imaginable on a monkey can be justified if you simply name the imaginary pleasure, benefit, or outcome that's supposed to result from this experiment. So what do they do? What is the procedure in the European Union where there are strict legal, definitions about when you can and can't torture animals to death? You know what's done? Analysis of alternatives. Analysis of comparable examples, where medical professionals, scientists, people doing this research at universities, they have to present, and they have to be challenged by counterarguments. They have to present what the other methods might be that could lead to the same scientific research being done without harming animals or with doing dramatically less harm to animals. And this results in innovations, right? So if you say you're going to do experiments, this is a real example, but I'm simplifying it off the top of my head. If you say you're going to do experiments that involve keeping dogs in captivity and these dogs basically being miserable so that you can have mosquitoes, let's say the mosquitoes are carrying malaria, whatever the disease is, but you can have these dogs in a laboratory living their whole life in a kind of Perspex case with these mosquitoes on them, all right? But tormenting these dogs and tormenting some mosquitoes, think about the benefits in terms of malaria research, think about the progress that can be made, how much pleasure human beings are going to get out of this, right? It's a complete dead end to present this kind of utilitarian calculus. But you know what was productive? Was saying, wait a minute, why do you need the dog in a cage? Why can't you just have a plastic membrane and then have, the food, the nectar for the mosquitoes to drink underneath it? Why can't you breed the mosquitoes in a cage without having a mammal there for them to drink their blood? Can't we redesign this experiment? In this way, the amount of harm, the amount of suffering being done to animals has been challenged and has been reduced, but not through the pleasure-pain calculus, not through utilitarian methods. The utilitarian theorem fundamentally, both in the real world and on the chalkboard, does not work. When we talk about killing a cow, having a cow live under a steel sky, in a shed, on a concrete floor, in a fenced-in area that's tiny for its whole life, just so one day it can have its throat slit. When we talk about the harm done to this cow, we're talking about something real. And when we talk about the enjoyment of the meat, we are talking about something much less real, or I might go so far as to say something unreal. Why? Can't be quantified, can't be falsified, not verifiable, not generalizable, not universal, right? For example, one person enjoys eating the meat and another person doesn't. There's this kind of subjective variation of behavior. But dude, when you get into what people find pleasant, what they find enjoyable, when you get into the real depths of this, man, it gets dark quick. No. There's no way I would enjoy some of the things my fellow human beings would enjoy. These pleasures, what people consider pleasure, what people consider enjoyable, this is not something that's quantifiable, verifiable, countable. There's no unit to measure this in the way that we can count how many apples are loaded into the back of a truck. There's a difference between saying something is unknown and that something is fundamentally unknowable. There's an anecdote about a Hollywood actor who had a scene in a movie, and the script called for him to say, "Alcoholism is an incurable disease." And he changed the line to make the scene more interesting, and he instead said, "Alcoholism is not an incurable disease, but it is a disease for which there is no known cure." So there's no cure that's known yet. What an interesting suggestion that in some hypothetical future, there would be a cure for alcoholism known. I am not saying to you that the quantification of pleasure, the assigning of a unit value to happiness, is a scientific problem we have yet to solve. It's not that it's a riddle that will one day be unraveled. It's fundamentally flawed in such a way that you can never assign a unit to happiness. You can never quantify human pleasure. And the nature of harm being contrasted to it, we can talk about hypothetical examples where people are talking about their hurt feelings or their hurt pride, where we start to get to equal levels of absurdity or equal levels of abstraction where it can't be quantified on either side. It can't be given a unit value. But when you're actually comparing torture, murder, death, rape, torture to interrogate someone, to produce military intelligence or something, real situations like this that are really in the real world in the 21st century, questions that are being asked and where governments have to come up with answers, questions about torturing animals to death for scientific research. These are real world examples. My point is fundamentally, you will never be able to quantify pleasure and have a real number in contrast to the very real nature of suffering, harm, and pain. Now, when I look at my own father as an example, he was a man who enjoyed things I could never possibly enjoy. The things that made him happy in life, I would find rebarbative and disgusting and even evil. I'm just going to give you one example here. He owned a small business, he had a small number of employees, and he had a common email service for the company. So they had a work email address. And unbeknownst to his employees, he delighted every day in reading their private emails. He would even go to the office early so he could try to read their private emails before they received them. and he would delete emails before the recipient had seen them. And then he would delight in coming back a few days later to see the two people angry at each other because they never replied to the email. So, someone might send an email saying, oh, hey, I'm going to be at this event on Thursday, so I assume I'm going to see you there because you're going to this other thing nearby. Something like this. He would delete the email, and then he'd get to laugh, he'd get to smile, he'd get to be happy when a few days later he would read the email of one person being furious, the other saying, hey, why weren't you there? I went to this event on Thursday. I thought you were going to be there for this reason. You never replied to me, but I assumed you were coming. People are disappointed and people are upset at each other. And my father was happy. My father enjoyed this, right? You can pick any set of examples you want, whether from the world of Orthodox religious people, what they enjoy is very different from what I enjoy in my life, whether from the world of people who are into BDSM or people who are into drug addiction. You know what? My father, pretty psychologically disturbing case study, but he was perceived as normal. He was perceived as someone who had no mental problems at all and no addictions, all right? As subtle as the difference may be between being homosexual and heterosexual, what they find pleasurable is significantly different. As subtle as the difference may be between someone who enjoys the feeling of drunkenness and someone who does not enjoy it, someone who rebels against it and feels, not just doesn't think intellectually, but feels, this is a waste of my time, I'm being poisoned, this is intoxicating me, this is toxic, this is something bad and evil and wrong, and I can't focus my mind to do the kind of work I really value because I'm drinking this alcohol. Someone who feels that way is different in some sense from someone for whom the highest pleasure, the main thing they enjoy in life, is drinking alcohol. Okay? The list goes on and on. What is pleasant to you may not be pleasant to me. It may reveal how profoundly alien we are from one another. But if I cut off your arm, I am doing harm in a very real sense. And the harm done to you by cutting off your arm is the same as if, vice versa, that harm was done to me. The nature of the harm we're contrasting in this pleasure-pain calculus, right? That is more real than the nature of the pleasure and the happiness that you're putting on the other side of the balance. The pleasure-pain calculus is evil because it justifies any evil imaginable. And one of the fundamental logical flaws built into it is this notion of quantification, this notion of assigning numbers, of making an equation in which you're comparing something real to something unreal.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.